everybody, and welcome to the show. Now, I was going to do this episode on the single independent stroke, but I did something really idiotic this week. I decided it would be a good idea to go play football with my middle school kids while wearing dress shoes. And I was having a really good game, but I jumped up to do something and I landed and rolled my ankle really hard, and now I can't walk or really play the marimba if I have to move left or right. So we will do today's episode on interval changing, and we'll do all those crazy exercises I wrote for next week if I can walk. So enjoy the episode. Here we go. First up, we have the small interval changes. Now, these are probably the easiest to do because all you have to do from the default Stevens position is curl in the index finger. That's all you have to do. Curl in the index finger, you can play all the small intervals you want. Now, most people don't actually have trouble with the small intervals. They have trouble with the large intervals. So let's talk about that for a second. The tricky part about the large interval change is that the inner mallet needs to sit at the base of the middle finger. And this produces a challenge when you're trying to roll the mallet over there. There's a huge clump of skin right here that gets in the way. And Stevens calls this the speed bump. It's this clump of skin you got to get past and get back from when you're getting the mallet to the base of the middle finger. So this takes a lot of practice to get used to, but once you do it, you'll realize it's so much easier than the other techniques that people use. So here's how you do it. You're going to take your thumb, this joint right here, and you're going to push down on the mallet, which will prop it up in the air, like that. And then after you prop it up, you're going to push with the index finger and pull with the middle finger to get it over to the base. So prop up and then pull. And then you just kind of do the reverse to get it back. Prop up, pull. And after you practice for a really long time, you can do this kind of really ridiculously fast, making interval changes a breeze, but it just takes a while to get used to. For really large intervals, or if you're trying to get larger than an octave, you're going to have to do just a little bit more than getting the mallet to the base of the middle finger. You're going to have to pooch out the lower two fingers to get an extra couple inches from the outside mallet. And it looks something like this. Or from the bottom view, you're going to pooch them out like so to get those extra couple inches you need. To practice this motion of the smaller fingers, in the book Method of Movement, it gives a really humorous exercise where you take these two fingers and pretend to scratch an imaginary itch on your palm. And it's a really good illustration for how to develop your muscles to do this sort of thing. I would also note that you generally don't use that technique when your mallets are not at an octave. Usually it's at an octave already, and then you use that technique. Because if your fingers are in a normal position and you're trying to move those fingers to move that outer mallet, it causes a lot of strain on the tendons. So it's generally only used at large intervals. Now, before you start practicing this technique of interval switching, the first thing you need to do is get used to what this octave feels like in your hand, because it feels a lot different than the other intervals that we've done. So the first thing I would recommend that you do is just practice maybe some scales with the octave to really solidify the muscle memory in the hand. Once you have your muscle memory down for how that's supposed to feel, I highly recommend that you do all of your practicing away from the keyboard. In fact, I mastered this technique away from the keyboard about 2 months before I could actually do it on the keyboard. It's just a whole different realm when you got all these keys to look at and positions and chords. So just sit around if you're on a bus or a car or you're bored during class, you can get 2 pencils and stick them in your hands and just practice this interval spreading technique until it feels really good in your hands. And after you can effortlessly do it away from the keyboard, bring it to the keyboard and practice some exercises. Now, I will warn you, this takes work, it takes practice, it takes persistence and effort, but the rewards are very smooth and relaxed interval changing. A lot of people use this technique where they keep the shaft in the center of their palm, and it really causes trouble for them later down the road. What you'll typically see with younger players is they do these small interval changes and they're like, wow, that's so comfortable. And they assume they can just roll out the octave and keep the shaft in the center of the palm, and they do something that looks like this. But this causes a lot of issues for them, and they'll defend it to the death about why their way is great and everyone should just do it this way because it's easier than learning the actual printed correct technique that Stevens came up with. But this just causes a lot of issues. Let's take a look. Now, the first big issue that this center of the palm octave style presents is that it doesn't actually get you an octave in most registers. In fact, right now, I can only get a seventh. So that leads people to try to do the pooching of the lower fingers to try to achieve the octave, or they stick their thumb in between their mallets to achieve the octave because it's not quite big enough. But with the thumb in between the mallets, you're going to have a really hard time getting the mallet back to a small position. And a lot of players are misled because you can play easier pieces using the thumb in between the mallet technique, or trying to get the octave out with the other two fingers or something like that. You can do that on easy pieces so they get really used to it, they get really comfortable with it. But the second they move on to an advanced piece, they have a really hard time getting their octaves, or they start getting tendonitis from doing the incorrect technique. And I want you to avoid that path. Now, when I was in college, I was one of those guys. I was trying to use this technique because I couldn't figure out how to make the other one work. And I was like, yeah, I can make this work, yeah. But I was playing Gordon Stout's Etude, I think it was number 1, and it has those ninths in there, and I just couldn't make it work, and my fingers were hurting, and I was like, oh. So I was like, all right, I'm just not gonna play that piece. I'm gonna play a different piece. So I started playing another piece that had these really fast interval changes, and I was still having a little bit of trouble, but I wasn't sure if it was because I was inexperienced or because the technique was bad. Well, luckily, Nebojša Chivkovic came and gave a concert, and afterwards we went out to this big dinner, and I asked him about 1,000 questions. But one of the questions I asked him, I was like, hey man, is it okay to keep the shaft of the mallet in the center of your hand when you're doing an octave? And he was like, no, it's a terrible idea. And I said, well, why is that? And he was like, here's why. It falls right out of your hand. If you make one small mistake and hit your mallets together, or you accidentally catch the rope in a wrong, accidentally, it'll fall right out of your hands. And that can be really embarrassing in a concert. If you're holding the mallets in the correct fashion, it doesn't go anywhere. It's 100% secure. Here's another issue that you're going to run into. Remember how we talked about to get larger than an octave, you need to poke out these lower two fingers, doing the pooching method, as some people call it. The issue with doing your octave with a shaft in the center of your hand is that your middle finger is still tucked in. And this makes it really, really hard on the tendon in your ring finger to move out. Here's what I mean. Perhaps you've done this in elementary school. You tell someone to take their palm, put it on a table. And then you take your middle finger and you put the knuckle on the table, like so. Well, in this position, you can move your thumb, you can move your pinky, you can move your index finger, but I actually can't lift my ring finger. I can't, it's impossible. It is tied together with the middle finger. I cannot lift the ring finger. So if you are doing this position where the shaft is still in the center of your palm and your middle finger is still clamped down, trying to poke out the lower two fingers is incredibly painful on this tendon right here because the middle finger isn't going with it. If you're doing the correct octave technique, the middle finger comes away from the palm. And doing this with your lower two fingers becomes a snap. So this makes ninths and tenths incredibly easy to do in comparison to the other method that people sometimes use. Now, when you start applying this technique, you'll notice something very interesting in the left hand. When I am at a position of a fifth in the lower end of a marimba, I can either do it with the standard technique, or I can actually do it with this inner mallet underneath the middle finger. So which one do you use? Well, if I'm switching between an octave and a fifth and an octave and a fifth, I'll do the fifth with the mallet underneath the middle finger. If I'm just doing small interval changes, I'll do it in the standard fashion. And this gives you a lot of flexibility, especially when you're going really quickly between the two. Okay, I was going to save the exercises for the video on the double vertical stroke, but I'll whet your appetite a little bit. I'll give you two. The first one is one that I use to warm up with every day. I figured that when most people do their interval changing exercise, they play a bunch of these small intervals, but they only actually play the octave like 2 times in the whole exercise. So I decided, okay, in my exercise, I'm going to play the octave in between every single interval change. So I typed this up and I put it on the website, so if you want to go to marinebiology.com and click on it, that's great. But this is one of those exercises that it's probably easier if you just watch somebody do it instead of actually trying to read the notes. So here it is. I don't know what to call this. We'll call it octave crawling. Yeah, octave crawling. Here we go. And lastly, here's another one that I actually showed a little bit of on the 2 mallet exercise episode, but it's called PM. I wrote it in 2004 when I was on tour with the Crossmen, and it goes to every kind of interval you can possibly have, including some extended intervals of a tenth at the end that you need this extra little bit of inch from your lower 2 fingers for. So here's PM. That's all for today, everybody. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.